Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we are working still on our A+. That's right, it's the never-ending certification, right? It's so much information, and joining us back in the studio to continue to shovel that information into our little brains so that we can pass that exam, our good friend Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, we're so glad to have you again, and how's it going?
It's going great. You say that so eloquently.
Yeah,
it sounds like it's, I don't know if it's a good thing or it's pain, right? But yeah, you know, that Dan's right. Well, there's a lot of information you need to understand, and a lot of good information, a lot of stuff really that you could potentially run into in your IT careers, and especially as you are leapfrogging into IT. So that's right. We are back with just a few things that we have to kind of look at when it comes to troubleshooting hard drives and, well, this concept we've been mentioning in the title since we first started, you know, way back 20 years ago, called RAID array, troubleshooting RAID arrays. You know, remember that in a past episode we kind of talked about what RAID was and showed you some of the different kinds that you could expect to see on the exam. Remember, it's a way to take a couple of disks or more and we bond them or aggregate them together, and we can do this for a couple of reasons. We can do this for a performance gain, right? We could speed up the time that it takes to get access to that information or to write to that hard drive, or we can do this for the purposes of ensuring that if one of the drives fails, we still have access to the information that is so crucial to us and our businesses, right? We talk about the difference between RAID 0 and RAID 1, right? RAID 0 is striping, that gives us the performance, if you will. RAID 0 is mirroring, that gives us the fault tolerance, dual copies of your data. Talk about RAID 5, tries to give you the best of both worlds, if you will. It's that striping with the distributed parity, so that if one of the drives fails, you're at least still operational, unlike mirrored. If one of the drives fails, well, you're out of luck, right? But you still have access to your data. Now, that being said, we talk about fault tolerance, right? Or we talk about a failure. How does a failure potentially manifest itself? Well, sometimes it doesn't, right? There's a couple of things that they call out RAID not working. They also call out RAID not found. All right, so let's go ahead and let's kind of just dive into a couple of things that might cause this. And sometimes it can be hardware error, right? It can be hardware failure, but sometimes it can be configuration error. Configuration error could cause it. Somebody misconfigures the RAID array, and that can cause problems. It could cause you not to find the RAID array. It could cause it to not work, right? The other thing I also want you to keep in mind, and this is something, Dan, believe it or not, I had to deal with in my motherboard that I've had. It's outdated by today's day and standard, but even going out the gate, when I put Windows 7 on it, I went to install the operating system. I created the RAID array, right? I went to install the operating system, and when it got to the installation screen that we talk about in 902, I didn't see anywhere to install the drive or install the operating system. So we had a problem, right? And one of the problems was the chipset driver, right? Windows didn't have built into its driver store a chipset driver that would allow the operating system, even in the pre-installation environment, right, that's loaded into RAM, to even know that the RAID controller existed. So I had to have a driver.
Seems like a problem.
It really is, right? Because the drivers are what allow our software to talk to our hardware.
So you had basically a guy speaking Russian and another guy speaking Swahili, and they're going, I don't know what you're saying.
And zero translator standing in the middle. That's right. So we weren't getting much done. And that's why I had to have a little USB thumb drive, and I plugged it in and had the driver. And during the Windows installation process that we demonstrate in other episodes, I could say, hey, Windows, that's okay. You don't have that driver built into the driver store, so I can point you to it. And then sure enough, it loaded it into RAM, and then all of a sudden it says, oh, okay, I see that storage container there. You can go ahead and install your operating system there. So that could be a reason, right, that you don't see the RAID array or RAID not found, RAID not working, right? Remember, drivers are important. Your operating system needs to be able to recognize the hardware as well as speak to it. And if those drivers aren't there, that might not happen, right? It could be a module or a service that you're running that is shut off as well. So again, a couple of things that, you know, we talk about before we even mention the hardware configuration, right? So let's go ahead. We've got a machine here that has a RAID array already set up on it, and more specifically, it is a RAID 1 configuration with a stripe, and it is a 128 kilobyte block size, which means the chunks that are written across the drive in the stripe are going to be 128K in size. Now, Dan, if you'll do me the honors here, and we're going to look at the BIOS screen here. We'll go ahead and let's boot into BIOS, if you will, there. All right, and here we can see that it is booting in to the system. I want to go ahead, and one of the things that I'm going to do is I kind of boot into BIOS there, the one-time boot menu. Like we've mentioned before, these are the Dell machines, so we're using the F12 here, and you can kind of see, I went ahead and named the volume there so we can see what we're looking at. So that's the boot volume, right? And I can tell that RAID is recognized just because, well, I named that volume when I created the RAID array, and you can see Intel A+, RAID 0 there. Now, that isn't something you usually see. We're not actually seeing the RAID configuration, but at least I know for my benefit that, hey, I know it can see the RAID. Now, what might cause a RAID array to not be recognized? Well, let's go ahead and we'll get back into the settings like we did earlier when we were looking at BIOS, and we'll get into the system settings themselves. And by the way, in the background there, what you've seen was a little voltage change, I believe, and that's probably the CMOS battery telling me, because I've been messing with this machine a lot, that might be time to replace the machine. Yeah, the CMOS battery. All right, so what are some of the things that might cause the RAID array not to be seen or RAID not found? Well, I want you to go ahead and look at the drives here. Now, when we look and get into the drives, and this is specific to this Dell BIOS, yours might be a little bit different. Notice that we have, for instance, we have what's known as the SATA operation. Now, the SATA operation, understand that we get RAID on, all right? And I'm not so worried about some of the auto detect and advanced host configuration interface, if you will, the AHCI or ATA. What I'm really worried about for the exam here is the RAID being on or off, right? If I turn around, and one of the things that I do is, let me tab over here. And let's see, sometimes you can use the mouse on these things. The interesting thing, though, is the mouse doesn't seem to want to work too well on our shiny surface here. So let me get back up to the SATA, is that I could, if you will, turn this off, right? I could essentially put this in a legacy mode, and notice it says changing these settings may prevent your operating system from booting or require a reinstall. All right, well, that could be a problem, right? And this is one of the things that would cause the RAID array not to be detected. Remember, I said it doesn't necessarily have to be a hardware failure. It could be a misconfiguration, right? Somebody could come in here and say, oh, I'm just going to turn this off because I don't understand what that is. They get in here and they go Jiminy Crickets on it, and unfortunately now we have a problem. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say no to this. That certainly isn't something that you want to do. My head's kind of covering up. You can see that we have the apply option. All right, I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, and we're going to try to boot into the RAID configuration itself. So sometimes this is a little bit different on the way you configure it, even though we're in the BIOS itself. And I'm going to say no, don't change anything here because we certainly don't want to break it. We're going to let it reset. And one of the things that you're going to notice is that BIOS here, it goes through this initial configuration. You'll see the Pixie boot try to start here, but when in the Dell systems here, you'll also say that it'll say configuration, and it says Control-I. I know that was kind of quick, and we did that kind of fast here, but notice that here's where I could configure the RAID array, right? I could point it to the different disks, if you will, within the RAID array itself. Notice that at the top we've got the RAID ID 0. I named it. That's what we're seeing in the one-time boot menu there. It tells me the level in the third column there. It says it's a RAID 0. It's a stripe. Tells me what the stripe block size is and what the overall capacity is. Notice that it also breaks down the individual disks that make up the RAID array, and it tells me that, hey, what's the status of, well, disk 1 there, right? In this case, disk 0. Remember, 0 counts in binary. So disk 0 is one of those members. It's 149 gigabytes in size. I see disk 2 is another Western Digital with its ID likewise, and that's another 149 gigabytes. Remember when we were talking about RAID array and configuring or trying to figure out what the overall capacity of the RAID array is, and a RAID 0, we said you just add up all the capacities of the drives that make up the RAID 0 array and total them up. So you can see that's why it says there at the top that the RAID size is 298. All right, so This is where we would see, maybe a potential to recover if we don't see that RAID array. Let's also give you, we're going to go ahead and what we're going to do is we're going to give you an idea of a RAID failure, right? Because what we see here is normal operation. That's not really going to help you, because that's what you should see, right? Well, what happens if the drive isn't recognized? So we're going to go ahead and do that, and we'll reboot this machine, and when we come back from rebooting the machine, we'll see if it's a little bit different. So Dan, I'm going to take the opportunity here, and I'm going to see if I can't break this machine, and then we're going to see if we can't bring it back as well. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and we'll see you in a bit. All right, Dan, let's see how well I broke this RAID array. And if you could do the honors there, sir, and push power on that thing, we'll see if we can get back into our machine.
You got the nice black screen so far.
Hey, yeah, that's absolutely a great sign, right? We have nothing to look at, and you can see it's kind of booting up here. So we'll give it a second. We'll let it boot up, and this time we're going to just do a normal boot, right? We're going to see what happens when this machine starts to load up. Now, one of the things I can see is that, well, notice right there, it says status has failed. Notice the stripe there. And over there at the top column on the right, we can see status, no. Bootable, no, right? It says that the drive isn't found. Now it gives me the ability that I can run an onboard diagnostic, and like we've seen earlier when we run a diagnostic, it's going to go pretty much the same. A lot of the Dell onboard diagnostics are going to be the same type of interface, and it's going to do that. It's going to try to find that drive, right? Well, at this point, it really probably won't find the drive. All right. So what happened? Well, there could be a couple things that happened. We've already talked pretty extensively about connections and power, and you definitely have to make sure about that. Another thing that could happen is that the drive is part of the actual drive itself could have failed. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll do a reboot on this machine, and we'll get into the setups here, the settings again. And when we get into the settings, what you're going to see is we can look a little bit more. Actually, let me go ahead and do that one more time. Sorry about that, guys. I don't want to actually get into the BIOS settings yet. What I want to do is get into the RAID configuration and see what the RAID configuration utility is telling us. And in this case, to get into the RAID configuration, we're going to do a Control-I. And the good thing is, and I don't know if you could hear those beeps right there, but it kind of balked at us and said, it is, that's right. It isn't too happy at me. And notice the difference here, right? We've got one member disk, right? And RAID controller has a RAID ID. It knows that that is a member disk, again, just part of the RAID array that was there before. But notice that we have a failed status. And the failed status is the same thing that we see on the post screen, all right? Now, we could also boot into BIOS, and we could see that maybe the fact is that the drive is no longer there. So that is one of the things you can see when a RAID fails. All right, so what would happen if this was a RAID 0 in this case? Well, unfortunately, we've lost all our data. And hopefully,
done like dinner.
That's right. Hopefully, we've run a backup utility, and we have our data backed up to an external location. The other thing that we're probably going to have to do here is we're going to have to replace the failed drive, and we're going to have to rebuild the RAID array. All right, so let's go ahead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the failed drive, and we're going to reboot this machine, and we're going to show you exactly how you could rebuild the RAID array. So we'll see you in a bit. All right, so what we did is we went ahead and essentially, guys, we hooked back up the drive. We used a loose connection here as a way. Dan, if you can help me out here, let's go ahead and boot this machine back up. And we'll get back into the RAID configuration utility. Now, understand if you're replacing a drive, it's not going to be so simple as we boot the machine back up and it says, oh, well, there's the member disk that was a part of the RAID array. So we're going to take this from the perspective that that drive has failed. And one of the things that we can actually do here is we can get into the RAID configuration. Now, you see the member disk has come back online, all right? In the real world, if that drive has failed, you wouldn't have that option, right? So what would we have to do? Well, what we would have to do is basically delete the RAID array that existed, and that would take that member disk that's still kind of hanging on to the past there, and it would completely format it. Now, you have to be careful. Notice that in this one, we have number 2 there, allows us to delete the RAID volume, and it should give us a warning at some point. You know, sometimes it'll pop up, sometimes it's as bold as you can see right here. Hey, you better be careful in the deletion of this because you are going to lose all of the information. Now, if this is a mirror, be careful because you still have your data. One of the first things I would do is just clone the entire drive, then delete the volume. That's the purpose of the mirror. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we'll do the old DEL there. And again, it's letting us know, hey, this is going to be a bad thing, right, if you do end up deleting the volume. Now what it's doing is notice that it changed from member disk to non-RAID disk, and that's letting us know that, hey, we do have RAID turned on, but none of the hard drives that are within the system now are a part of a RAID array. And that's where we go to, well, we could reset all disk. We could do that as well. I like to delete the actual RAID volume because it removes the ID. And now we can create the RAID volume. Now we can name this whatever we want. I did this for the purposes of me being able to tell what the heck it is that I'm doing. I'm going to do A+ here, and I'll call this a, I tell you what, we'll do a mirror on this one. Rated, I don't know what rated is. That's our own standard here, right? And that's part of it, right? And then what we'll do is we'll just kind of enter that in. It's going to ask us, you know what RAID level do you want? Notice that it says we got the option to do RAID level. I'll tell you, well, we'll just keep it RAID level 0 for consistency here. And then it gives me the ability to select all the disks that are in the system if I wanted to. In this case, we only have 2. Notice that I really don't have an option. Stripe size, there's there's always some debate of which the drive size, what stripe size should it be. I'm just going to go ahead and leave the 128K block size, if you will. Notice that it gives me the capacity there. I'm not really going to change the capacity. There's not really much that I can do here because it is a stripe. It's going to total up all of the drive capacity. We'll go ahead and just say enter here, and then it's going to ask me, do I want to create the volume? Notice that in creating the volume, it's letting you know that, hey, if you had any information on this before, it's going to be gone. And there's really nothing you will be able to do about that. Now, the next thing I want to kind of move on to is that if you are going to now, you just created this RAID array, you're going to have to reinstall your operating system. Remember I was talking about boot sequence? Well, we've got a little USB drive here, and I'm gonna fly off the cuff on this one, and I'm gonna hope that it's still configured the way it was yesterday. I'm really not sure, but we're gonna find out. So let's go ahead and let's reboot this system here, and let's take a look at the BIOS as this thing does reboot here, and hopefully it's rebooting on us, and we're gonna boot into the one-time boot menu this time. And I really hope that we see the USB drive here somewhere in the list. It should be initiating that USB drive. Notice the configuration utility is there. That's a good thing. Now notice we have a couple of options. I can't boot to the RAID array right yet, right? There's no operating system on it. So your OS wouldn't be found. It would be a failure to boot. I'm going to go ahead and choose the USB drive here. And hopefully what we're going to see is that it's going to give me the legendary press any key to continue. I found the any key. It's on the bottom of the keyboard. Just kidding, guys. We're going to just boot into our Windows operating system. And what we should see here after a bit is the ability essentially to install the operating system and basically start this machine over from scratch. Now, understand that in this episode, we're really not going to take you through the installation process because it's a long process here and it could take a while. We definitely tackle that on the 902 because they get more into the operating system. One of the last things that I just want to kind of mention that are in the list here, they talk about crash screens, proprietary crash screens. Windows has their blue screen of death. You also see, for instance, in the Mac world, they have their little text that happens when there's a blue screen, or it's not a blue screen, but they call it a kernel panic. It's when you have a system shutdown, when you have a stop error. Something happens within the hard drive, RAM, CPU, general fault protection happens, and essentially it shuts everything down and the computer reboots. However, you will also have inside of the Mac world, you have what's known as the pinwheel. And the pinwheel can be when slow performance happens. I know Dan and I have struggled on and off sometimes with our Macs here where we're running something and it takes a while, right? In Windows, you get the spinning Cheerio, I call it the blue Cheerio, that sits there and just kind of spins. It used to be in the old days, it would be a little hourglass, I believe, that would rotate. And I'm not exactly sure what it's in because Linux has so many different types of cool graphical user interfaces. I'm sure it's probably slightly different in each one, right? So you do have those. Keep in mind the proprietary crash screens as well as the BSOD, that's the acronym for blue screen of death, and again that is a stop error, as well as they call it a kernel panic. That's a more generic term. Every single system has to have it. Now they do call out one tool that I noticed that I haven't mentioned here, and I do want to kind of talk about it just real briefly. They call out screwdrivers. One of the things you'll notice when we were looking at these machines, not a single machine that we've showed you in this episode needs a screwdriver, right? You might need one, but more so today that what you're seeing are drive sleds, right? You have these rails that attach to the drive and they're toolless, right? You can slide the drives in the bay. and they lock in place, and if you need to take the drives out, you just pinch them and pull the drive right out of its bay. That is more common today. It makes it toolless. It makes it very easy. About the only thing you really need a tool for anymore, Dan, is removing the motherboards, right? Because they have to be bolted down because you don't want vibration, and certainly you don't want them making a contact, if you will, to any electrical component, because of the traces on them could basically electrically arc out the system. So I know, guys, guys and gals, this has been a long journey here, but hopefully we've given you some of the ideas and really the hands-on on some of the things you can see inside of troubleshooting your hard drives as well as your RAID arrays.
All right, Wes, thanks for walking us down that road and holding our little hands so that we don't feel like lost little lambs in the woods. But like you said, we are at the end of that episode. Thanks for watching, everyone. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.